How much of a threat is coronavirus to the world's food supplies? There are serious warnings of a global shortage as the pandemic spreads. So, how can the availability of food be safeguarded? And can a famine crisis be averted? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Bernard Smith. Widespread famines of biblical proportions. The UN is warning COVID-19 could cause an unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe. It says the number of people who can't get enough to eat could double by the end of the year. That's more than 250 million people. 21,000 people already die of hunger every day, and that number could soar if people don't get help. Food supplies are limited by lockdowns and people's incomes are drying up. Poor countries affected by conflict, economic crisis and climate change are particularly at risk. The UN says this could drive a wave of refugees and threatens an exponential rise in social unrest. The World Food Programme has previously been pledged $1.9 billion and is urging donor nations to live up to their commitments. The UN and other organisations working on extreme hunger say 55 countries already facing crisis are now highly vulnerable to the impact of the virus. And last year, 10 suffered their worst food crises to date. They include Afghanistan, Venezuela, South Sudan, Syria, Nigeria and Haiti. Yemen now faces the world's worst malnutrition crisis, and the number of its people acutely short of food is expected to exceed 17 million. The World Food Programme already offers a lifeline to nearly 100 million people. Most are trapped in war zones. But if they can't be reached, the WFP says 300,000 could starve to death every day for the next 3 months. The World Food Programme says urgent action is needed to avoid a humanitarian disaster.
We need all parties involved in the conflicts to give us swift and unimpeded humanitarian access to all vulnerable communities so that we can get the assistance to them that they need regardless of who they are or where they are. We also need, in a very general sense, humanitarian goods and commercial trade to continue flowing across the borders because they are the lifeline of global food systems as well as the global economy. Supply chains have to keep moving if we are going to overcome this pandemic and get food from where it is produced to where it is needed. It also means resisting the temptation to introduce like export bans or import subsidies, which can lead to price hikes and almost always backfire.
Agriculture and food ministers from the group of 20 countries agreed in a virtual meeting to guard against any unjustified restrictive measures that could lead to excessive food price volatility in international markets and threaten the food security and nutrition of large proportions of the world population. Emergency measures in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic must be targeted, proportionate, transparent and temporary, and that they do not create unnecessary barriers to trade or disruption to the global food supply chains. So let's introduce the panel. In Suffolk, in the United Kingdom, we have Jane Howard, spokeswoman of the World Food Programme. In Kano State, in Nigeria, Kabir Adamu, managing director at the Bank of Agriculture. And in Lampeter, in Wales, Patrick Holden, the CEO of Sustainable Food Trust. Welcome to you all. Jane, if I may begin with you. What is the connection between all the global lockdowns we're having and the increasing risk of famine? Help us understand that connection.
Well, what we're worried about at the World Food Programme is that this health pandemic could turn into a hunger pandemic, not so much because of the effects of the virus, but because of the economic consequences. Because if people are in lockdown, we know how difficult it is here in the Western world. But if you're in a country where you really need to work as a day labourer to get the money to earn the food for that night's dinner, you're going to be in a really difficult situation. I mean, people are really living hand to mouth. And whereas we're looking at our store cupboards and thinking, oh dear, what ingredients am I going to use? There are people out there who don't have store cupboards and they don't have savings. And that's why they're so vulnerable. And that's why we're so worried.
Kabir, that's particularly something that's relevant to Africa, to Nigeria. What is the risk of all these increased lockdowns on then producing famine?
Well, it is true, in Africa, particularly in Nigeria, more than 60% of, the population, they live on subsistence farming. And about 40% of, that live in the rural areas. Mobility, is key, to farming, either by way of, rendering the inputs, to the farmers, particularly now that we are at the period of harvest, and then in some, locations in Nigeria, the rainy season has started. So the farming season has actually, started. And therefore, the inputs, that is seeds, fertilizer, agrochemicals, need to get to them, at the right time. In the same vein, to harvests, that have been done needs to be moved, from the farm locations, to the marketplaces. So with this lockdown and curfews, in some, areas, it is a great challenge, to the farmers. And, if they don't sell their produce, to the market, certainly, there will be nothing for them, in the pocket, not to talk of, food in the table. So it's really a great challenge. But I know that in Nigeria, government is doing a lot. Recently, the Honorable Minister of Agriculture made a pronouncement that, farmers will be excused, from the lockdown, to allow them move around, to carry out their farming activities.
Jane, do we see there, you were mentioning people who subsistence living, what they earn that day goes to what they eat that night. Is the risk for them of hunger and starvation more of an immediate threat than the coronavirus?
I think that we don't really know what's going to happen. We don't know what scale it's going to roll out on. But we know that already in the world there are 821 million people who just struggle from day to day to get the food that they need to live a healthy life. And we know that only this week, the Global Report on Food Crises came up with a much, much higher number for the number of people who are acutely hungry. And that was already because of the conflicts in the world, the extreme weather because of climate change, and the economic situation. So now we are realizing that as this crisis unfolds, that the economic consequences could be worse than the actual virus in terms of tipping the people who are at most risk, tipping them over in the edge into possible famine. And we're especially worried, out of the 100 million people that the World Food Programme feeds every year in terms of food assistance and cash, we're really worried about 30 million of those, many of them living in conflict zones or in areas where the economy is not working all that well anyway, and access for food assistance is difficult. Those are really absolutely the people we are most worried about, because those people are just hanging by a thread. And we would really have to act now, come together as the world to do something about that, to stop them being tipped over the edge.
So, Patrick, is there a risk as we try and stop the spread of COVID, do we risk tipping people into starvation? Do people risk starving to death when we're trying to stop the spread of COVID-19, Patrick?
I think there's no doubt that in the present system, which is highly globalized and based on very large-scale production units, very often exporting to other countries, the collateral damage in the short term on workers who are unable to earn a sufficient income as a result of the interruptions to international trade could be very serious. But I think there's a deeper underlying problem, which is that the globalized systems of food we have are not resilient against shocks. And the COVID pandemic has illustrated the fragility of the food systems, which currently rely on international trade, The food we buy in supermarkets, we have no idea where it comes from, who produced it. They have no loyalty towards us. And as we now know, countries that are facing challenges in relation to food security will put their own populations first, and rightly so. So we need to plan ahead for a different kind of food system structure.
Jane, the world has had severe hunger crises before because of whether it's weather, whether it's economic downturn, wars, political instability. What makes this different?
Well, I think it's not something that's really been seen since the Second World War. We're used to coping with an emergency caused by a typhoon or a hurricane or an earthquake. We all learned a lot of lessons after the financial crisis of 2008, but it's hitting the world at a time when instead of food security improving over the last couple of decades, we seem to be making quite good progress towards eliminating hunger in the world. But then, sadly, the numbers started to go into reverse, partly because of conflict and the growing, evident climate shocks that we're getting used to seeing now. And I think it's coming at a really bad moment. That's what I'm saying. It's coming at and that's why you can't help thinking of it as the perfect storm. And instead of it just being in one country, this virus knows no borders. Indeed, trade is so interconnected now. Everything in the world is interconnected. You have countries like Yemen that are dependent on food imports completely. So if the shipping goes wrong or truckers get the virus, it's going to be difficult for them. But then you've also got many countries in Africa who depend very much on exports such as oil or copper or commodities. And if there's a global recession, then they're going to get hit that way too, in that they will lose their income, they will lose their jobs. And it's the sort of bad timing of having this, the last few years of terrible wars, civil conflict, storms, droughts, floods, the whole lot. It just seems to be hitting all at once. And I think it's true that so far, when a country is confronted like this, whether it's Italy, the UK, the US, I mean, you have to focus on your country 100%. So it's very difficult for the global community to plan ahead and think about how we might come together to respond globally.
Kabir, do you get the idea that this is something on a scale that the African continent has not had to deal with before, and it's had more than its fair share of food security crises? Is this something different?
No, I think, it's a globalized, situation, the problem. So it affects, every segment of, the world. What I see is, in Africa, the farmers, in particular, they are a critical partner in food security. And therefore, government places, so much importance, in protecting them. First and foremost, I think, educating them to even understand and, agree, that the virus exists, is, first and foremost. Before now, when it started in China, most of, the farmers are not actually sure of what the virus is all about. Just killing people indiscriminately, is something that has never happened. And, they don't understand, they don't even believe. But now that it has come to our doorstep, people are beginning to say, look, this one is a challenge that has no boundary. And therefore, every one of us, including government, must come together to see how we protect ourselves. And more so, and more critically, the farmers. Fortunately, our farmers, most of them are in the rural areas. There are people that, are not, as enlightened, or they are not people that, socialized, so much as people in the urban areas. So getting, the virus, restricted from reaching them, I think, it's something that is going to be simpler than dealing with, the urban population. I know that, in Nigeria, for example, the government is so much concerned about what is happening. And what the Central Bank of Nigeria did, initially was to give moratorium on all loans, agri loans that were given to farmers, so that they can have more time, within which to pay. Again, interest rate, was cut down by more than 3 digits, all in an effort to motivate and, make the farmers, strong. And then there are so many other stimulus package, that the government has put in place. Just last week, the central bank released a 50 billion naira targeted credit facility to household and, small and medium enterprises, that have, adverse effect, as a result of, the COVID, 19. And all these things are going concurrently, to make sure that we make, the farmers and our people stronger, so that we can curb the spread of the disease and also be able to take up the challenge as soon as, the whole crisis is over.
All right. Patrick, is this a problem that those in the developing world can say, those in the developed world can say, well, it's not our problem, it's not going to affect us, this is the sort of thing that only affects Africa and Asia? Or is there a risk to the developed world from the food shortages elsewhere?
Seems to me that this is a challenge for every single country on the planet, regardless of whether we're a so-called developed country or a developing country. The challenges will be different, but nevertheless, we need to respond in a rather similar way, because the first and foremost requirement of every nation is to maintain its own food security. And it can best do that by ensuring that as great as possible a percentage of the staple foods, the foods that that nation can grow easily and consume on a daily basis, are produced and consumed in that country. And what we have done during my farming lifetime is moved away from that approach towards a globalized system where people are incredibly vulnerable to sudden interruptions. Of course, this happened during the Second World War, but it hasn't happened on this scale since. And I think, just to take the example of an African nation that I visited a few years ago, Zimbabwe, which during the Mugabe time didn't really get much access to food aid for political reasons. And in southern Zimbabwe, the villagers there were reliant on the traditional food systems, which are remarkably resilient because they were diverse, they didn't need pesticides and fertilizers, and they managed their food systems in a traditional way. And it seems to me that all over the world, we need to regard this as a wake-up call to move back towards less centralized and more decentralized food systems and redesign the distribution from the farm to the final consumer in an appropriate way. This is a need for every nation on the planet, as I said.
Jane, should we be going down this more decentralized route, or does that run the risk of some countries introducing protectionist measures?
Well, I think Patrick is exactly right that, the food system now is global and it's all interconnected. And I think that actually we may find that it's people living in rural areas are better off than those living in urban slums. If you think about, slums, and the kind of living conditions that many people, the poorest of the world, are facing, they don't have the measures that you would use to stop the virus, hand washing and social distancing, are just very, very difficult. They don't necessarily have clean water to cook their food with. But I'd just like to come back to, the example of Nigeria. I think it's very, very interesting to hear how the Nigerian government is really working to set up some kind of safety net and educate people and inform people as to what's going on. And for example, the World Food Programme, we're already acting to protect the people that we are helping already. And in Nigeria, we're helping about a million people a month. And what we're doing is sort of buying up food and giving people 2 months, or if in some countries 3 months supplies in advance, so that they can just get through these next few weeks and weather the storm. Because we don't know what's around the corner next, but we've got to be ready as far as we can in terms of the humanitarian response, setting up an infrastructure, recognizing that in many places there are no airlines running anymore. So we need to be able to fly in, help the World Health Organization, help other NGOs, help other governments supply in medical supplies. I mean, already since January, we've sent airlifts of medical kit and personal protection equipment to 86 countries. But you need an actual sort of infrastructure to set up the emergency response, to just get us through the next few months, and then have those safety nets, whether it's school meals for children, that now we're having to look at giving children, families takeaways because there's nobody in school. So it's like a classic emergency response, which is multiplied, and we have to live with the food system that we've got at the moment, and that is completely interconnected and globalized.
And Kabir, if things weren't bad enough already, we have the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization warning of new swarms of locust in East Africa. They'd already suffered with that earlier on in the year. There are now more on their way, and that's the way they deal with that is being affected because it's not possible to spray pesticides apparently or get them into the country. So how will that new outbreak affect food security there as well?
Well, like I said, the lockdowns and the curfews are creating so much problems that government and stakeholders have to sit down and look at, to confront them, head on so that we can find, a solution, to it. I see the post-COVID, era, to be a transforming one in the sense that things will no longer be, the same. The smallholder farmer, for example, has suffered, a lot. He has seen how, he's deprived the daily needs, as a result of, this. So definitely things are going to change. The way the value chain and the supply chain is going to react to what has happened, is going to, make the system, more efficient. Programs like, the, FAO, and the rest, have a role to play. In coming out with, solutions to, some of these problems. But I can tell you that, African governments, particularly in Nigeria, they are so concerned. And, on daily basis, conversations are going on to see how these issues can be addressed.
All right. And Patrick, do you think that what is happening now is going to be a severe enough of a shock to the system to give us this new way of distributing food, more adaptable and sustainable, that you want to see?
I hope so, because I think this is a fork in the road. It's one of these moments when we can either continue on the road we've been going down for the last few decades, which is persuading so-called developing countries to develop export markets for commodity food, often not very well paid for, quite low prices, to the developed countries such as the US and the UK and Europe, where there are markets for these foods, often at the expense of the food security of the exporting nation, and I would argue at the expense of the environment and the planet. And I think that the new road, which needs to be adopted by the FAO and all countries throughout the planet, is to recognize that actually there should be a form of protectionism, protection of the indigenous people and their staple food supplies. And that is an enlightened form of protection, and it should form the basis of all future international trade. Of course, there should be trade in food. I mean, countries like South Korea or Japan or the Yemen, who have a structural deficiency of being able to feed themselves, will continue to need to import food. But as a general principle, we should be as food secure and resilient as we can, nation by nation, region by region, and we need policies to encourage that, including the new trade deals, which are going to come, for instance, in my country after Brexit. It shouldn't be a matter of just unfettered international trade. There should be restrictions. OK, well, unfortunately, we are out of time, ladies and gentlemen, but thank you very much to all of our guests, to Jane Howard, to Kabir Adamu and to Patrick Holden, and to thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Bernard Smith, and the whole team here, bye for now.